Winter doesn't just expose bad weather, it exposes bad decision-making. Only in America can a blizzard hit and someone thinks, no coat? No problem. I'll buy a novelty space heater shaped like a chicken. And trust me, that's barely the warm-up. 1. A man in Minnesota walked straight past the winter coats on sale and proudly purchased what he called a high-tech heating solution, a USB-powered heated scarf that plugged into his phone. He truly believed this 8-inch strip of fabric with the warmth output of a dying candle would protect him from a wind chill that could probably qualify as a minor deity. He wore it outside, watched his battery drain to 0 in 12 minutes, then stood there shivering like a sad statue powered by regret. When people suggested a coat, he doubled down and insisted the scarf was basically the same thing, just more minimalist, which is an elegant way of admitting he placed fashion above survival. He then spent the rest of the day indoors Googling, "Why do my teeth shake?" still refusing to accept that a garment providing less insulation than a warm thought might not have been the smartest winter investment. 2. A woman in Chicago decided that instead of buying a coat, she would invest in what she described as a luxury hot chocolate strategy. Her logic was that constantly drinking warm beverages would heat the body from within, which sounds like advice she found in a medieval apothecary's handbook. She spent nearly $200 on artisanal cocoa powders, gourmet marshmallows shaped like endangered animals, and a mug so heavy it probably required a permit. She then went outside in a thin sweater during a lakefront wind advisory and discovered that hot chocolate loses most of its thermal effectiveness when the cup is shaking violently and your hands are turning the color of uncooked chicken. By the time she reached the bus stop, the marshmallows had frozen, the cocoa had solidified into pudding, and she had achieved the rare honor of becoming a walking cautionary tale about treating beverages like central heating. 3. One guy in Colorado refused to buy a winter coat because he claimed modern outerwear was a scam invented by Big Jacket. Instead, he purchased a $300 novelty onesie designed to look like a giant penguin. Yes, a flightless bird costume was his chosen method of thermal regulation. The suit's fabric was about as thick as a grocery bag, but he insisted it felt insulating because penguins live in cold places, which is not how biology or textile engineering works. He wore it outside once, instantly transformed into a waddling wind catcher, and discovered that the suit's zipper froze shut, trapping him inside like a very confused mascot. Passersby kept asking if he was part of a street performance, which only amplified his suffering. He eventually got inside by dragging himself home like a black and white tumbleweed, still swearing the coat industry was a conspiracy designed to suppress avian-themed fashion. 4. A customer in Maine walked into a sporting goods store during a blizzard and, after examining the coat section for an impressive 3 seconds, decided he didn't need outerwear when he could buy an emergency winter poncho. This poncho was essentially a $4 sheet of crinkly metallic foil designed to cover a person in situations where medical professionals are already on their way. He strutted outside wearing something that looked like a baked potato wrapper caught in a windstorm, claiming he felt surprisingly warm. 10 minutes later, he was chasing pieces of his outfit down the street as each gust peeled away another shiny fragment. Drivers slowed down, not out of concern, but because he literally sparkled like a malfunctioning Christmas decoration. When the poncho finally shredded itself into non-existence, he returned inside the store dripping melted snow, still insisting the poncho would have worked better if the weather wasn't so aggressive. 5. A Texas transplant living in Boston thought he didn't need a coat because he purchased a $250 smart warming patch, a small adhesive heating pad marketed to people who apparently confuse skincare products with thermal gear. He stuck the device to his lower back and bravely walked into a nor'easter, acting like this tiny rectangle of battery-powered optimism would be his personal force field. Within minutes, his torso was freezing, his legs were numb, and the patch itself overheated under his sweater, leaving him with the deeply unglamorous gift of a mild burn. He tried removing it mid-blizzard, which led to him flailing around under his clothes like he was trapped in a one-person slapstick routine. The patch eventually fell off and blew away, probably still warming the air somewhere more effectively than it warmed him. Yet he maintained it almost worked, proving that denial is the real winter accessory. 6. A woman in Detroit skipped buying a coat because she found a heated shoulder cape online that looked like something a Victorian ghost might wear during physical therapy. It claimed to deliver targeted warmth, which turned out to mean it warmed a tiny semicircle around her collarbones while the rest of her body was free to experience the harsh realities of Midwestern wind. She wore it to work and discovered that when you heat only one part of your body, the contrast makes everything else feel colder, like her torso was filing a formal complaint. Co-workers described the cape as an electric bib, which did not help morale. She also learned that the device beeped every time its battery dropped below 20%, which meant she shuffled through the office emitting the sad chirp of a low-power smoke detector. By lunchtime, she admitted defeat and wrapped herself in free paper towels from the restroom. 7. Somewhere in Wisconsin, a man convinced himself that layering multiple hoodies was equivalent to a real winter coat. Not one good hoodie. No, he wore 5 extremely thin, stretched-out hoodies stacked like an edible arrangement of bad decisions. He looked like a laundry basket that achieved sentience. Every layer trapped just enough cold air to create a refrigerated parfait around him. But he insisted the thermal math checked out. Then the temperature dropped, and he discovered something scientists already knew. Wind slices through cotton like it's auditioning for a role in a horror movie. He walked to his car stiff as cardboard, each hoodie sleeve freezing into a slightly different angle. People passing by gave him that universal winter look that says, "You had options." When he finally reached his car, he declared he was a little chilly, which is the most polite way of saying his entire torso had entered a witness protection program. 8. A woman in Ohio proudly purchased a $180 faux fur fashion shawl she claimed would keep out the cold while still looking glamorous, which proved to be incredibly incorrect. The shawl was made from synthetic fibers roughly as insulating as a wet napkin, but she wore it anyway because the online reviews said it was very soft. She ventured out during a snowfall, instantly discovered that faux fur absorbs snow like emotional trauma absorbs therapy sessions, and ended up carrying around 5 pounds of frozen fluff. She shuffled into a store dripping slush, leaving behind a trail that janitors had to salt repeatedly because it refroze into decorative hazards. By the time she reached home, the shawl had transformed into a rigid, ice-crusted collar that made her look like a glamorous statue who died at a winter gala. She later admitted it wasn't made for weather, which is an interesting flaw for something wearable. 9. A college student in Vermont believed he could beat winter by buying a $39 heated steering wheel cover and simply staying in the car as much as possible. He treated his vehicle like an emotional support animal instead of transportation. His plan unraveled when he realized that heated steering wheels only heat the steering wheel. Meanwhile, his feet, hands, legs, and dignity were left entirely unprotected. He spent a full week sprinting between buildings wearing a t-shirt, yanking open his frozen car door, and gripping the steering wheel as though it were a sacred artifact radiating life. Students passing by watched him sit in the parking lot, clutching the wheel with the intensity of someone attempting telepathy. The worst part was discovering that heated covers take several minutes to turn on, which meant he spent those minutes shaking violently while whispering encouragement to an inanimate object that clearly did not care. 10. A man in Pennsylvania chose not to buy a coat because he found a tactical winter bandana marketed to outdoorsmen who apparently enjoy freezing stylishly. The bandana covered only the lower half of his face, leaving the rest of him exposed like a poorly funded superhero. He believed the word tactical meant effective, when in reality it meant expensive triangle-shaped cloth. He stepped outside looking ready to rob a snowman, immediately discovering that while his chin felt cozy, his arms and torso were filing emergency evacuation orders. Wind lifted the bandana repeatedly, causing him to inhale a mix of cold air and disappointment. Eventually, the fabric iced over and stuck to his face, turning him into a very confused human popsicle. He spent the afternoon thawing it off under hot water while reluctantly admitting that gear designed to keep cowboys warm in movies might not be optimized for real-world January conditions. 11. A woman in New York decided the perfect winter purchase was a full-length fleece robe, which she proudly wore in public as if it were outerwear. She claimed it was basically a wearable blanket, which was technically true in the same way that wearing a tent is basically a house. She stepped outside and immediately discovered that fleece robes, unlike coats, have the structural integrity of wet tissue. The fabric flapped open with every gust, revealing that she had paired it with summer leggings, as though winter would politely avert its eyes. People around her stared with the same expression you'd give someone walking a ferret on a leash indoors, confused, concerned, and slightly entertained. By the time she reached the subway, The robe had soaked up enough slush to double its weight, and she resembled a wizard whose spells only worked indoors. She later upgraded to an actual coat, but only after the robe tore itself on a turnstile. 12. A guy in Idaho bought what he called thermal arm warmers, the kind cyclists use during mildly chilly weather, and decided these would replace a coat entirely. The result was an upper body outfit consisting of a t-shirt, 2 neon compression sleeves, and a level of misplaced confidence usually reserved for reality show contestants. He stepped into a snowstorm and realized almost instantly that warming your forearms does nothing for your torso, especially when the rest of your body is actively auditioning for the role of frozen meat section Exhibit A. The sleeves began to slide down repeatedly, creating a chaotic flapping situation that made him look like he was constantly trying to signal an airplane. Snow accumulated inside the t-shirt, and he became a walking snow globe with no holiday value. He finally retreated indoors with arms slightly warm, but everything else one step away from filing a workers' comp claim. 13. In Washington state, a woman decided she didn't need a coat when she could layer strategically, by which she meant wearing 3 silk scarves tied together into what she believed was a fashion-forward winter shield. The scarves fluttered dramatically in indoor lighting, but outside they offered about as much protection as a decorative napkin taped to a house during a tornado. She wrapped herself tightly, stepped into a freezing drizzle, and instantly transformed into a mobile windsock. Each gust tightened the knot around her neck, leaving her frantically adjusting the ensemble while pretending it was intentional. Pedestrians kept giving her concerned glances because she looked like a Renaissance painting caught in a mechanical fan. By the time she reached her destination, the scarves had absorbed moisture, lost all structure, and fused into something resembling a damp linguine necklace. She confidently claimed it almost worked, which is an adorable thing to say about wet string. 14. A man in Utah tried to conquer winter using a personal space heater helmet, a plastic dome sold online that supposedly traps body heat around your face. He believed this device would replace the need for a coat, which is bold optimism considering it looked like a salad bowl with ventilation holes. He ventured outside wearing it and immediately learned that it fogged up faster than a teenager's car windows at prom. This left him wandering blindly down the sidewalk like a lost astronaut whose mission control abandoned him. The helmet collected condensation until droplets ran down the inside, giving him the ambiance of living inside a malfunctioning terrarium. Meanwhile, the rest of his body endured temperatures better suited for Arctic wildlife documentaries. Eventually, he removed the helmet mid-walk, and the sudden blast of cold air caused him to gasp loudly enough to alarm nearby pedestrians. He carried the device home like a defeated bowling trophy. 15. A woman in New Jersey refused to buy a coat because she had already purchased what she called a heated fashion belt, which promised to warm her core, a claim only technically true if you define core as one very narrow horizontal strip. She strutted outside wearing the belt over a thin sweater, convinced she had hacked winter with technology. The belt delivered warmth in a steady pulse roughly equivalent to a cup of microwaved oatmeal, while everything above and below it froze like she was being refrigerated in sections. Commuters watched her shuffle through the streets with her arms wrapped around herself like a malfunctioning action figure. The belt's battery pack died halfway through her commute, leaving her with nothing but a cold nylon strap and the crushing realization that she had invested in a glorified heated waistband. She eventually bought a real coat, but only after admitting that accessorizing cannot replace insulation. 16. A man in Montana refused to buy a coat because he found something he considered far more advanced: a pair of battery-powered heated socks that he decided to wear on his hands as dual-function winter gauntlets. Somehow the idea of socks replacing gloves and a coat simultaneously made perfect sense to him, as though winter were a polite suggestion rather than a meteorological threat. He confidently marched outside wearing socks on his hands, a t-shirt, and the kind of optimism that usually precedes an ER visit. The socks warmed unevenly, heating only the tops of his knuckles while the rest of his body endured wind that could sandblast a barn. When he tried using his phone, he realized touchscreens are not designed for woolly oven mitts powered by questionable lithium cells, so he stood outside shouting voice commands while trembling like a caffeinated chihuahua. By the time the batteries died, his hands were sweaty, his arms were numb, and his pride had frostbite. 17. A woman in Philadelphia decided she didn't need a winter coat because she had discovered what she described as a revolutionary warming method: bubble wrap. She wrapped herself in 3 layers of the stuff, taped it shut like a poorly shipped package, and announced she was insulated. physics immediately disagreed. Bubble wrap pops under pressure, and the human act of walking is, apparently to her surprise, full of pressure. Every step produced a symphony of tiny explosions, drawing the attention of strangers who thought she was either performing modern art or attempting to shed her earthly form. Worse, bubble wrap isn't designed to block wind. It channels it, funneling icy gusts directly toward the skin like a passive-aggressive air conditioner. She eventually reached her destination, sounding like a microwave bag of popcorn entering its final moments. Her friends refused to remove the tape, claiming this was the natural consequence of treating packing materials as clothing. 18. One guy in Nebraska bought what he thought was a brilliant winter solution: a massive dog sweater he intended to repurpose as a tight-fitting torso warmer. He squeezed himself into it like a man losing a wrestling match with a tube sock. The sweater barely reached his ribs, leaving his midsection exposed like a crop-top enthusiast who lost a bet. He strutted outside, believing the garment would expand with body heat, which is not how knitwear or thermodynamics work. The sweater stretched unevenly, restricting his arm movement until he walked with the stiff, panicked posture of someone trying not to drop 3 invisible plates. A gust of wind hit him, and the sweater rolled upward like a malfunctioning window shade, exposing even more skin to temperatures normally reserved for preserving prehistoric megafauna. His final act outside was desperately tugging it back down while muttering that maybe he got the wrong size, as though that were the only flaw. 19. A woman in Wisconsin saw an advertisement for winter-proof leggings, which turned out to be regular leggings with a slightly fuzzy interior and absolutely no scientific credentials. She decided these could replace a coat entirely if she wore them on her arms instead of her legs, assembling an outfit that made her look like 2 sock puppets had extended themselves into sentient roommates. She marched outside with her torso unprotected, convinced that insulating her limbs would somehow trick the cold into leaving her alone. Instead, she resembled a wind chime of human discomfort, with her upper body suffering while her arms enjoyed modest warmth. The leggings sagged repeatedly, pulling her arms downward like a puppeteer having a morale crisis. Pedestrians stared because she looked like she had been halfway swallowed by athletic wear. By the time she returned indoors, her torso was frozen, her leggings had stretched into oblivion, and her belief in online advertising remained suspiciously intact. 20. A man in Oregon refused to buy a coat after deciding that a $90 heated travel mug was all he needed to maintain inner warmth. He carried it around like a personal talisman against hypothermia, sipping from it constantly while ignoring the growing icicles forming on his eyelashes. He truly believed that warm liquid in a cup could somehow radiate through his clothes and create a protective aura, like he was starring in a low-budget magical realism film. The mug warmed his hands briefly, but left everything else exposed to wind that felt like it was filing a complaint directly with his bones. At one point, he attempted to hug the mug to his chest for warmth, looking like someone attempting to romantically bond with stainless steel. When he inevitably spilled it on himself, the warm tea instantly cooled, leaving him wet, cold, and holding what was essentially a fancy thermos-shaped accessory for poor planning. 21. A woman in Minnesota thought she'd outsmart winter by purchasing a micro-heated neck pillow, apparently believing that warming a single vertebra would cascade upward into full-body comfort. She walked outside wearing a thin cardigan and the pillow, which glowed faintly like a sad halo of misplaced optimism. The pillow hummed weakly, radiating exactly enough warmth to remind her she could have bought a real coat at any time. Instead of insulating her, it simply highlighted the contrast between her lukewarm neck and the disappointing reality that her arms, torso, and soul were freezing. When snow began falling, the pillow absorbed moisture until it gave off steam, making her look like a malfunctioning robot trying to avoid detection. She eventually admitted the device wasn't built for movement, which is an odd flaw for something meant to be worn by a living human navigating an environment famous for its lack of mercy. 22. A man in New Hampshire skipped buying a coat because he purchased what he called winter tactical hand warmers, 2 metal cylinders that heat up when activated, and apparently convinced him that heating his palms was thermally equivalent to insulating his entire body. He held them proudly like he was charging an attack in a video game, completely ignoring the fact that every inch of him not directly touching the warmers was embracing a wind chill that could sandblast granite. He wandered around trying to keep the warmers pressed to his ribs, armpits, and face, juggling them like a person playing the worst game of hot potato in recorded history. At one point, he dropped one into the snow and stared at it helplessly, realizing he had voluntarily chosen technology that required opposable thumbs in weather that actively interfered with thumb functionality. He later declared the warmers effective, which is technically true if your only winter priority is comfortable hands. 23. A woman in Colorado purchased a thermal yoga wrap, a long stretchy band meant for gentle indoor stretching, and convinced herself it could function as winter clothing if she wrapped it around her entire upper body. What she created was essentially a human burrito held together by overpriced elastic. She took to the streets unable to bend her elbows, her torso bound so tightly she looked like she had been packaged for shipping. The wrap did provide some warmth, but only because she couldn't move enough to let heat escape. A strategy commonly used by hibernating animals, but less ideal for navigating icy sidewalks. She fell 3 times because her arms were restricted to the point where catching herself was impossible, turning her commute into a slapstick performance she did not choreograph. When she finally peeled herself out of the wrap, she discovered deep red lines on her skin that resembled topographical maps of regret. 24. A guy in Illinois decided that instead of buying a coat, he'd buy 6 thermal headbands and wear them like armor plating across his torso. He stretched them over his chest, shoulders, and upper arms like someone trying to assemble a superhero suit entirely from clearance bin accessories. He walked outside believing the multiple layers would distribute heat strategically, which is a poetic way of saying he didn't understand how cold works. The headbands rolled upward repeatedly, snapping back into their original shape with the intensity of a rubber band seeking vengeance. Each snap made him flinch violently, giving bystanders the impression he was fighting invisible bees. Snow collected in the gaps between the headbands, forming tiny pockets of misery. By the time he reached his destination, he was freezing, bruised, and still insisting he just needed tighter ones, as though upgrading the tension of elastic bands could somehow defeat winter. 25. A woman in Michigan purchased something called a heated fashion shrug, which was essentially a short-sleeved half-sweater that claimed to warm the shoulders and upper back. She was convinced that warming this single region would create a radiant heat effect, as if her body were a convection oven. She wore it with enthusiasm, but the shrug's tiny heating panels only warmed 2 patches of skin while the rest of her body embraced the winter like a hostage. As she walked outside, the shrug kept riding upward, eventually settling near her neck, like it was desperately trying to abandon the mission. Wind blew directly under it, creating a personal wind tunnel that made her feel like she was standing in a weather simulation lab. By the end of her walk, her shoulders were warm, her torso was frozen, and her face carried the unmistakable expression of someone who had been personally betrayed by an article of clothing. 26. A man in Washington decided he didn't need a coat because he owned a winter survival poncho, which was basically a large plastic sheet marketed to doomsday preppers and people who misunderstand climate. He wore it proudly into a storm, looking like a sentient trash bag brimming with unwarranted confidence. The poncho flapped violently with every gust, making him sound like a loose tarp trying to lodge a complaint. Snow slid down the plastic in clumps, repeatedly slapping against his legs like the universe delivering feedback. The hood funneled wind directly into his ears, creating a haunting whistle that followed him down the street. Because plastic does not breathe, condensation built up inside until moisture dripped down his arms, giving him the experience of being lightly rained on from the inside. When he finally reached shelter, he had achieved the rare look of a man simultaneously soaked and dehydrated. 27. A woman in Iowa purchased something called a heated posture corrector, which claimed to straighten her back while providing warmth. She decided it would serve as her winter gear, wearing it over a thin blouse like she was bracing for mild discomfort instead of weaponized weather. The device heated her upper spine while leaving her ribs, arms, and sanity exposed to the elements. She walked outside rigid as a board, the posture brace forcing her into a stance that suggested she was preparing to deliver a royal proclamation rather than walk on ice. Every time she shivered, the brace buzzed in protest, thinking she was slouching instead of desperately clinging to life. Meanwhile, snow collected on the exposed straps, melting and refreezing into little bands of misery. By the time she arrived at work, she had perfect posture and no functional body heat, a trade-off that fooled absolutely no one. 28. A man in Ohio believed he could replace a coat with a novelty heated seat cushion he carried around like a comforting pet rock. He held it flat against his chest as he ventured outside, convinced that anything heated must inherently provide insulation. The The cushion warmed him for approximately 6 seconds before the wind whisked that warmth away like it was confiscating stolen property. Worse, the cushion wasn't designed to be held upright, so the internal heating element sagged, concentrating all warmth into one depressing hotspot that did nothing for his survival. He kept repositioning it desperately, turning his walk into a chaotic dance routine performed for absolutely no one. Eventually, the battery died, leaving him clutching an oversized, lukewarm rectangle like an actor in a tragedy who misunderstood his prop. He later insisted it helped a little, which was generous considering it achieved less than a cup of lukewarm soup. 29. A woman in North Dakota proudly purchased a winter aromatherapy wrap, which promised relaxation, warmth, and seasonal comfort, a phrase that apparently convinced her it could stand in for a coat. The wrap heated up when microwaved and released lavender-scented steam, which she believed would calm her through the cold. The problem was that microwaved fabric cools rapidly in actual weather, turning her aromatic confidence into cold, wet cloth emitting the final sighs of dying heat. She walked outside smelling like a spa trapped in a freezer, the wrap stiffening as the moisture froze. Passersby noticed that steam rose briefly from her chest before crystallizing, creating the illusion that she was slowly turning into an enchanted ice witch. The scent did nothing to soothe her growing panic, as she realized lavender cannot fight wind chill. She returned indoors clutching the now frigid wrap, deeply relaxed in theory and deeply frozen in practice. Winter stupidity never disappoints, and somehow we're still underdressed for it. Drop the dumbest purchase in the comments. Vote for the reigning disaster, and yes, stick around. It only gets dumber from here.